Late at night, with only his closest confidants in the room, King Charles quietly signed a royal order that would permanently sever Camilla's family from the royal residences they had long considered their own. No one anticipated it, least of all Camilla. The move was executed in total secrecy, with the kind of precision normally reserved for matters of national security that could not risk a single leak until the signature was sealed. The halls of Buckingham Palace were hushed, but the weight of the moment hung in the air like a shadow pressing against the walls themselves. The document was short, almost deceptively so, but its consequences were enormous. With just a few lines of ink, every housing privilege, every right of residence, every set of keys her family possessed to royal estates was rescinded. From the grandeur of Sandringham to the quiet cottages at Windsor, their access vanished in an instant. No warning, no compromise, no appeals. This was not the result of a fleeting impulse. Hours earlier, King Charles had sat in a tense private council with Princess Anne and Prince William. Those who glimpsed the trio noticed the severity in their expressions. It was not the warmth of family, but the hardened focus of leaders preparing to act. Words like duty, integrity, and accountability reportedly echoed in that room. At the center was an alleged breach of trust, so grave it risked staining the monarchy's image if ignored. For Charles, the choice was personal as much as political. These were his wife's relatives, the people who had stood alongside her for decades. But his oath to the crown demanded something greater than sentiment. It was one of those defining crossroads every monarch fears, protecting the stability of the institution even at the cost of the heart. And Charles knew the cost would be steep, both in public perception and in his own household. When Camilla finally learned of the decree, she was stunned. At first, she struggled to believe it, convinced there had been some mistake. But disbelief soon gave way to fury as the permanence of the act became undeniable. This was no pause or probation. It was exile. A total banishment from the royal spaces her family had treated as their own for years. Her anger was fierce, but behind it lingered a question. Why now? The truth was not rooted in that single day, but in years of small conflicts, private grievances, and growing mistrust. What began as quiet tensions had finally reached their breaking point, and King Charles had drawn the line with a single stroke of his pen. The truth is, this explosive decision didn't begin the night Charles signed the decree. It had roots stretching back years. Hidden beneath the polished surface of royal life were quiet tensions, whispered warnings, and betrayals that the public never glimpsed. For a long time, the friction stayed beneath the surface, dismissed by many as idle rumor. But slowly, quietly, Camilla's family began to treat the royal estates less as borrowed privilege and more as if they were their personal dominion. At first, the signs were barely noticeable. A few too many names added to a guest list. Visits that stretched far longer than originally intended. Little indulgences that could be brushed aside as harmless excess. But as time went on, the behavior escalated. Whispers circulated of private renovations carried out without the king's knowledge, of rooms altered to suit personal taste instead of preserving their historic character. Priceless heirlooms were moved, gardens redesigned, even royal staff diverted to tend private affairs that had nothing to do with duty or crown. These weren't minor breaches of etiquette. They were acts that steadily eroded the dignity of the monarchy. Palace staff, trained to serve with discretion, began to exchange quiet complaints behind closed doors. Veterans who had dedicated their lives to royal service spoke in hushed tones about arrogance, entitlement, and disrespect from people who had gained their influence not by merit, but by proximity. The unrest spread like an unseen crack in marble, subtle at first, then undeniable. And while most kept their silence, one voice rose above the rest. Princess Anne, with her seasoned eye and unwavering instinct, recognized the danger. She had witnessed enough over decades to know when invisible lines were being crossed. In private, she cautioned Charles, Her tone was measured but urgent. She reminded him that the monarchy's strength rested not only on tradition, but on the perception of integrity. Public trust, once damaged, could never be repaired. Charles listened. He always listened. But hesitation gnawed at him. He knew that moving too quickly might protect the crown, but it could also rip apart his marriage. But standing idle was the greater danger. To the outside world, none of this turmoil was visible. On public stages, Charles and Camilla moved in lockstep, smiling for photographers, exchanging pleasantries as though nothing was amiss. Yet to those who studied them closely, the cracks showed, a stiffness in posture, a flicker of tension in their eyes. And in hushed corners, whispers spread. Prince William, always the guardian of the monarchy's future, was losing patience. He had seen enough. Each day of silence, each act of unchecked indulgence, chipped away at the crown's moral weight. This was no longer about minor lapses or occasional excess. It was a sustained pattern, an erosion of discipline, tradition, and loyalty, the very principles upon which the monarchy's legitimacy had stood for centuries. Camilla's family had begun treating them not as sacred obligations, but as inconveniences. Yet, what finally forced Charles's hand wasn't mismanagement or entitlement. It was an incident so deeply personal, so unforgivable, that even he could not look the other way. It happened at Sandringham. What began as a simple winter retreat spiraled into a scandal that would echo in palace corridors for years. One of Camilla's relatives, emboldened by years of unchecked privilege, arranged a gathering that was nothing short of outrageous, opulent, sprawling, and wildly inappropriate for royal grounds. This wasn't a private family supper or modest celebration. It was a spectacle, with guests who had no rightful place anywhere near the sanctity of Sandringham's private quarters. The recklessness was staggering. Between the laughter and the clinking of glasses, an invisible line had been crossed, one that could not be repaired with excuses or apologies. The situation escalated when security officers conducting routine sweeps made a disturbing discovery. Private royal archives, sealed for decades, had been tampered with. Whether out of arrogance, negligence, or something darker, the files had been disturbed. In a monarchy where such documents are guarded with almost sacred devotion, the violation was an unthinkable betrayal. And then came the final blow. As staff combed through the aftermath, they stumbled across something far more intimate. Personal possessions of the late Queen Elizabeth II. Items that should never have been touched, let alone misplaced. In that instant, the line between carelessness and desecration was obliterated, and Charles knew the time for hesitation was over. The objects, kept untouched and in their rightful places since Queen Elizabeth's passing, were now disturbed, carelessly shifted, some even abandoned where they clearly did not belong. To those who still revered her memory, it felt like desecration, and for Charles, who carried the weight of his mother's legacy like a sacred duty, it was an act beyond forgiveness. Accounts from longtime attendants only deepened the outrage. They recalled hearing Camilla's cousin openly mocking royal customs, making sport of the traditions that had defined the monarchy for centuries. It wasn't just rudeness, it was open contempt for the very institution they had been privileged to inhabit. For many within the royal household, that night confirmed what they had long suspected. Certain members of Camilla's circle didn't see themselves as guests of the crown, but as entitled proprietors. Catherine, as ever composed, couldn't let the slight pass. In a calm but piercing exchange, she confronted the cousin. Her words were measured, but her disapproval was unmistakable. Those who witnessed the moment described the room turning cold, the air heavy with tension. The cousin's dismissive smirk in response only magnified the insult. Not long after, Charles's phone rang. The message was urgent, clipped. The kind of call that strips away sleep in an instant. One detail after another poured out. The reckless party, the breached documents, the mishandled heirlooms, the sneering insults. With each word, Charles's resolve hardened. This was no longer about missteps or lapses in judgment. It was a direct affront to the sanctity of the monarchy, committed within his own walls. And before Charles could even act, it was Anne who gave him the final nudge. She did not come with vague complaints or hearsay. She arrived prepared, carrying a dossier months in the making, an exhaustive account of every breach, every abuse of privilege, every quiet violation Camilla's family had committed. Large or small, each incident was a piece of a larger pattern that could no longer be dismissed. Anne's tone was steady, authoritative, but beneath it pulsed something deeper, a fierce devotion to the monarchy as their mother had envisioned it. She invoked the late Queen's relentless dedication to integrity, reminding Charles that the institution must remain above reproach, even within its own household. Her voice only softened when she spoke of their mother's legacy, warning that allowing this behavior to continue would not only taint the present reign, but dishonor the one that came before. Her words carried weight not out of sentiment, but conviction. This wasn't about Camilla's family enjoying a few luxuries. To Anne, it was about the erosion of the very values that had bound the monarchy together for centuries. Every unchecked indulgence chipped away at the foundation she had spent her life protecting. In her eyes, tradition wasn't antiquated. It was the glue keeping the crown intact in a world where public opinion could shift with a single headline. And she was not alone. Quietly, though not at first openly, William's stance aligned with hers. Both understood the peril of letting such behavior fester unchecked, and both were ready to act where Charles had hesitated. Behind closed doors, Anne and William had already spoken candidly about the problem. Their shared resolve forged a quiet but firm alliance. To them, Charles could no longer respond as just a brother or a husband. He had to act as king. And that meant shielding the monarchy's image, even if it meant stepping directly into personal conflict. At one point, Anne had even confronted Camilla herself. The meeting was outwardly polite, but unmistakably tense. Anne, with the authority of both a senior royal and the daughter of Queen Elizabeth, laid out exactly what could no longer be tolerated. Camilla, unaccustomed to such blunt criticism from inside the family, listened in silence, her face unmoved. Nothing was resolved. No compromise was reached. The chill between them lingered long after their words had faded. That left the decision squarely in Charles's hands. He could attempt to keep the peace in his marriage, ignoring the rising unease, or he could act, sending a clear message that the crown came before personal ties. The choice weighed heavily on him, but the evidence spoke louder than sentiment. In the end, Charles chose duty, and the way he chose to enforce it would leave Camilla feeling both publicly diminished and privately cornered. In the warm glow of his Buckingham study, Charles sat at his desk, the decree spread before him. The silence was thick, interrupted only by the steady tick of the mantel clock. Every line of the document had been shaped by months of frustration, formal testimony, and careful legal drafting. Each word was sharpened to withstand challenge. Once his pen touched the page, there would be no reversal. Standing nearby were not just witnesses, but key players in the monarchy's survival. William was present, his expression calm but unwavering, silently endorsing his father's choice. Anne stood opposite, her eyes locked on Charles, her earlier warnings echoing in the stillness. On either side of the desk, two senior royal solicitors waited, their presence ensuring that this decree would stand against any attempt to undo it, including by Camilla herself. The language was unambiguous. Effective immediately, every residential right granted to Camilla's relatives, permanent homes, seasonal retreats, even short-term stays, was revoked. With one signature, the privileges they had treated as entitlements were erased, and the balance of power within the royal household shifted forever. The decree went further than anyone expected. It revoked every key, every tenancy right, and every form of access to royal residences. Its language was clear, absolute, and impossible to reinterpret. This wasn't simply an eviction. It was a deliberate act of separation, a statement that only the crown decides who may live within its walls. When Charles finally signed the order, his hand shook, not with hesitation but with the weight of the choice. These were his wife's relatives, people he had welcomed into the most private sanctuaries of royal life, shared meals with, laughed with. And yet, his duty to the monarchy demanded this sacrifice. The scratch of the pen across the parchment sealed their fate, a decision that would ripple far beyond palace grounds. Almost immediately, Charles turned to the head of security and gave instructions in low, measured tones. Locks were to be replaced, passes canceled, belongings quietly removed. There would be no dramatic scene, no public confrontation, but the message would be unmistakable. The privilege they had enjoyed was gone. For Charles, the burden of kingship had never felt heavier. He had chosen loyalty to the crown over loyalty to his marriage, stability over harmony at home, and in the back of his mind, he knew this decision would alter his relationship with Camilla forever, turning a partnership into something more brittle, marked by quiet resentment. This was not just a legal directive. It was a declaration. The monarchy would not bend, not even for the queen consort's family. And with its binding clauses locked in, there was no path for Camilla to undo it, not through influence, appeal, or sympathy. What the crown had written into law, only the crown could erase. But the walls of Buckingham Palace could not contain the news for long. Word spread quickly, first among staff and courtiers, then beyond the palace gates. And when Camilla learned of the decree, she did not view it as royal procedure. She saw it as betrayal, not from enemies in the press or political adversaries, but from her own husband. The shock was quickly consumed by fury. To her, this was not about preserving the monarchy. It was about being humiliated. By nightfall, she was determined to confront Charles. At Clarence House, their clash unfolded behind closed doors. Those who overheard would later describe it as unlike anything they had witnessed before. Raised voices cutting through the halls, the calm composure of the royal couple shattered. Camilla demanded answers, insisting she had been blindsided, that her family had been treated like intruders rather than trusted kin. For her, it was not just a decree, it was a betrayal that demanded reckoning. Charles, steady in his tone, made it clear he would not undo what had been done. He spoke of responsibility, of honor, of the monarchy's need to remain unsullied. To Camilla, these sounded like polished excuses, words that disguised the reality that he had chosen the crown over his marriage. When she realized there would be no compromise, she turned inward, rallying her own allies. Behind closed doors, Camilla gathered her family. To them, this was not just the loss of privilege, it was an affront, a dismissal of the legitimacy they thought had long been secured. Their meeting was sharp, pragmatic, and deliberate. They knew the decree itself could not be reversed, but what they could do was seize control of the narrative beyond palace gates. Soon, whispers began reaching carefully selected journalists. Stories were spun portraying Camilla not as grasping or entitled, but as a woman betrayed, loyal to her husband, only to be cast aside in return. The timing of these leaks was no accident, surfacing just as public focus remained fixed on the scandal. For a moment, the tide of opinion wavered. Some in the press painted Camilla as a wronged partner. But inside the palace, the consequences were immediate. The once fluid cooperation between Charles's advisors and Camilla's circle fractured. Staff who had worked easily across both sides now moved cautiously, aware that aligning too openly with one faction might mark them in the other's eyes. The appearance of unity at the heart of the monarchy had been broken, replaced with a quiet but undeniable divide. William and Anne, however, were neither surprised nor shaken. They had foreseen Camilla's counterpunch and closed ranks around Charles without hesitation. In private, they reassured him that this was necessary, that the monarchy's long-term credibility outweighed temporary backlash. In public, they stayed composed, refusing to indulge in the drama, their steady presence silently reinforcing his decision. But outside the palace, the reaction took on a life of its own. Headlines erupted, social media seethed, and the country itself seemed to take sides. By the next day, polling revealed a decisive verdict. Nearly 3/4 of the public stood firmly with Charles. To them, his decree wasn't cruelty, it was leadership. It was the crown reclaiming its dignity after years of indulgence, and a long overdue show of strength against personal excess. The message could not have been clearer. Charles had chosen to act as king first and husband second, and for many, that was exactly what the monarchy needed. Loyalists wasted no time voicing their approval. From local halls to live radio shows, supporters hailed the decree as a decisive act of leadership. Some praised Charles for re-establishing boundaries that had blurred in recent years, seeing it as a long overdue correction. Others, with emotion in their voices, called it a continuation of Queen Elizabeth's vision, a reminder that the crown was never meant to bend for personal convenience. Words like duty, honor, and integrity echoed through their statements, framing the decision as both principled and necessary. But not everyone was applauding. Camilla's allies, both at home and abroad, condemned the move as nothing short of humiliation. They described it as a betrayal, arguing that it weakened not just her role, but the stability of the royal marriage itself. Some critics went further, accusing William and Anne of manipulating the king from behind the scenes. Their sharp rhetoric was calculated, crafted to sow doubts about unity at the heart of the monarchy. The media seized the opportunity. Reporters began dredging up Camilla's family history, old disputes, past scandals, questionable associations long forgotten were suddenly splashed across front pages. Each new headline chipped away at the sympathy her camp had tried to rally. Abroad, the story spread just as fiercely. Commentators framed it as Charles's boldest move since taking the throne, a deliberate gamble to reinforce his authority and prove he would not be ruled by personal attachments. Some admired it as a power play reminiscent of monarchs from centuries past. Others cautioned it might fracture the family in ways that could never fully heal. Under the glare of international scrutiny, Buckingham Palace finally issued a statement. It was brief, precise, and unapologetic. The decree, it said, was in the crown's best interest and would stand. No explanations, no compromises, no room for debate. The tone was firm by design, signaling that, at least in the palace's eyes, the matter was closed. But anyone who thought the fight was finished underestimated Camilla. For her, this was not the end. It was the beginning of a battle she had no intention of losing. Behind the heavy doors of Charles's study, husband and wife no longer faced each other as partners, but as rivals locked in a battle for power. The air was tight, charged with weeks of mounting strain. Camilla came with one aim only, to have the decree overturned. She dispensed with courtesy, her words as sharp as her tone. This, she declared, was more than an insult to her family. It was a direct assault on her position as queen consort. She demanded an immediate reversal, without conditions or delay. Charles listened quietly, but his silence carried no trace of doubt. It was the silence of a man who had already chosen his course. When he finally answered, his voice was firm, deliberate, and final. The decree would stand. There would be no revisions tucked into the margins, no concessions made in secret. He spoke not as a husband, but as a king, his words weighted with the authority of the crown. Camilla's reply cut deep, her anger sharpened by frustrations long left unspoken. Accusations tumbled forth, memories of sacrifices she had made, moments when she had defended him against criticism, the loyalty she had given without question. Now, she said, that loyalty had been repaid with cold detachment. Charles did not remain silent. He answered with grievances of his own, wounds long buried under layers of duty and restraint. Years of unspoken tension spilled into the room, each word widening the rift between them. It was not a dramatic rupture, not a slammed door or shouted threat, but something more devastating, a quiet recognition that the trust between them had been broken beyond repair. They could still share stages, still stand together before cameras, still play the part of unity. But behind closed doors, the fracture was permanent. Charles ended the exchange with resolve, not fury. He reminded her that the crown was bigger than either of them, larger than marriage, larger than family loyalties. His oath was to the institution, not the comfort of those closest to him. To him, this was not cruelty. It was the cost of protecting the monarchy. When their confrontation ended, there was no resolution, only silence, thick with the recognition that something between them had shifted irreversibly. Camilla walked out without a word, and Charles did not stop her. Both knew, without saying it, that the decision had cost them far more than they had imagined. But even after that final clash, a deeper shadow lingered. Locked inside the king's desk was another royal document, one the public knew nothing about. Hidden within the decree was a clause so discreet, so carefully woven into formal language, that only a select few inside the palace knew it existed. On the surface, the order was about removing Camilla's family from royal residences. But behind that straightforward veneer was a safeguard aimed at the future of the crown itself. Written to appear like routine procedure, the provision quietly fortified the path of succession, ensuring William, George, and Charlotte would inherit a monarchy free from outside interference. The clause imposed new restrictions that went far beyond housing rights. It barred Camilla's extended family from gaining influence over royal trusts, charities, or ceremonial appointments. No one outside the direct line could hold authority over the crown's assets or legacy. It was a tightening of control, consolidating the monarchy's most sensitive powers in the hands of the heirs alone. For Charles, it wasn't just about reining in overreach, it was about safeguarding the dynasty's continuity. Inside the palace, speculation swirled. Some believed the clause had been drafted after advisors warned that if Charles's health declined, unchecked influence from outsiders could complicate William's succession. Others whispered that it was William himself who insisted on the measure, making his support for the housing decree conditional on securing the crown's future stability. Either way, the result was the same. George and Charlotte's inheritance, both symbolic and material, would remain untouched by competing loyalties. Princess Anne's discreet approval proved critical. Without her backing, the provision might have been watered down or removed. But Anne, ever disciplined and precise, viewed it as a safeguard, not an attack. Her quiet endorsement gave the amendment weight no one dared challenge. Still, those who grasped its significance understood the risks. Evicting Camilla's relatives from housing was one matter. Cutting off avenues of power and influence was another. If the hidden clause ever became public, it could spark outrage, not just from Camilla's camp, but from those who saw it as a consolidation of authority into too few hands. The potential for deeper divisions was undeniable. And yet the machinery was already in motion. This was not an ending, it was a beginning. If Charles was willing to bury such a clause here, what else might he sign in the months ahead? For close watchers, it appeared the king was just getting started, tightening the crown's defenses one quiet signature at a time. In the end, it was never simply about housing. It was about the monarchy's future, and how far Charles was willing to go to protect it. After decades, a sealed vault hidden deep within Windsor Castle was finally opened, and what was uncovered shook King Charles to his core and sent shockwaves throughout the monarchy. Diana's true will wasn't merely hidden away. It had been weaponized. The royal archives had long been the subject of whispered rumors behind palace doors, a maze of secrets locked down tight by layers of protocol and royal decree. Since the tragic night of Diana's passing, one particular vault remained untouched. Some denied it even existed, while others quietly acknowledged its presence. Sealed under a special order from the Queen herself, the vault bore a plaque that read only, "For the future, when they are ready." No one dared ask who they were or what future the message referred to. But now, her sons had reached adulthood, and that future had arrived. It started with the discovery of a little-known clause buried deep in Diana's estate documents. A legal advisor found it tucked away in dense legal language, stating clearly that once the princes reached maturity, the vault's contents were to be opened in their presence, including the heir apparent. What took everyone by surprise was how swiftly the Queen ordered the family to convene. Some believed she was ready to finally unburden the family from what lay hidden inside. Others suspected she wanted to control the story before it escaped into the public. The day came. Palace aides hurried through the corridors, their footsteps bouncing off the stone walls, nerves humming in the air. "It's really happening," one whispered, clutching a stack of legal papers. She really left something behind. In the archive room's heavy silence, Charles, William, and Harry stood side by side, tense and uneasy, avoiding direct eye contact. Their grief for the woman they'd lost was tangled with a quiet fear of what she might have left for them to face. At the center stood the royal archivist, a tall, stern man no one seemed to know by name. Dressed in somber black, gloved hands gripping the key with care, he looked at the princes with only a faint hint of pity in his eyes. Charles cleared his throat, trying to ease the tension by saying this was probably just a formality. Letters, keepsakes, maybe a few instructions for his sons. But as he glanced around the room, his confidence wavered. The aides avoided his gaze, their faces pale and uneasy, as if they already knew more than they dared to say. When the archivist finally turned the key, the vault door clanged open with a heavy metallic sound, revealing a darkness that seemed to swallow the light spilling into the room. Charles took a steadying breath, forcing himself to step forward. He hoped, maybe too optimistically, that whatever was inside would finally bring some closure. But the moment a glimpse of parchment caught his eye, a knot twisted deep in his stomach. As the first words were read aloud, a heavy silence fell over the room. What Diana had left behind threatened to undo everything. Beneath layers of official paperwork lay a handwritten letter from Diana herself. Its words were so powerful they brought Charles to tears before he finished the opening paragraph. At first glance, the vault seemed to contain nothing more than a pile of legal documents, carefully stamped and signed by lawyers and palace officials, forgotten relics of the past. But just beneath the last page, hidden as if intentionally, was a single cream-colored envelope. Plain on the outside except for the bold, unmistakable inscription scrawled across the front. "For my sons, when the time is right." The room grew still. Even the archivist, who had remained impassive until now, lowered his gaze, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Charles reached out, but his fingers hesitated, as if the paper itself burned. Slowly, he pulled the letter free and unfolded it. It wasn't typed or dictated. Every jagged, purposeful stroke of the pen was hers, raw and filled with restrained fury. This was a will, but not the one the public had ever seen. It was something different, meant to be found only when her sons were old enough to grasp its meaning. Charles's hands trembled visibly as he opened the first page. Everyone held their breath, the air thick with both anticipation and dread. The opening line sent chills through the room. If you are reading this, then the palace has already failed you. William's jaw tightened as he exchanged a stunned look with his brother, and Harry's face grew pale. Charles blinked rapidly, lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. He kept reading, voice thin and shaky with each passing line. The tone grew sharper, more defiant, almost as if Diana herself stood before them, daring them to reject the harsh truths she laid bare. She spoke of betrayal and manipulation, of how she had been silenced and discarded beneath the weight of tradition and scandal. She warned them against becoming pawns in a far larger game, urging them not to accept blindly what they had been told. The princes shifted uncomfortably, and the aides exchanged nervous glances, fully aware that these words could never be unheard. No ceremony or protocol could erase the brutal honesty of her message, and the ancient room seemed to close in around them. Charles faltered as he reached the final sentence on the page, his voice cracking and tears welling up in his eyes. But what came next was even darker. Names, secrets, betrayals no one in that room was prepared to confront. Diana's letter was more than a goodbye. It was an indictment. Each sentence peeled back another layer of deception the monarchy had desperately tried to bury forever. As Charles continued reading, the weight of her accusations pressed down on everyone present. This was no ordinary will, no gentle farewell from a beloved mother to her sons. It was a record of everything Diana had endured, written with the quiet fury of someone who knew she'd never get to speak these truths aloud. Even on paper, her voice cut sharp through the silence. She began by revealing how she'd long been watched, not just by the press, but by people inside her own household. Her every move was monitored, conversations recorded, friends questioned. Shadows lurked everywhere, people she couldn't name but always sensed. Phones died mid-call, letters she never sent ended up on tabloid covers, and private moments were twisted into palace rumors. The deepest betrayal came from within her own circle, a torment she carried constantly. Then she named names, those she trusted who had leaked secrets to both the media and the family. People who smiled to her face but stabbed her in the back. Charles's voice broke as he read those names aloud. William clenched his fists, fury flashing in his eyes as his mother's betrayal unfolded. But it was the next line that stunned the room into silence. "My demise has already been planned." Those words hung heavy, impossible to ignore or erase. This wasn't paranoia. It was a direct accusation. Diana believed there was a secret deal she refused to accept, one meant to silence her, keep her out of sight, but alive. Refusing it, she claimed, sealed her fate. The letter then grew cryptic, mentioning jewels she was denied, jewels she hinted carried a curse and a story of betrayal, never meant to be exposed. She warned her sons not to be blinded by their sparkle or the dark history they held. By the time Charles finished that page, tears streamed down his cheeks, and his hands trembled. As he read aloud her final curse on the palace for turning her sons against her, a chilling silence filled the room. Just when it seemed the worst had been revealed, an annex to the will surfaced, Diana's ultimate act of defiance. Everyone assumed her legacy belonged solely to William and Harry, the sons she loved fiercely despite the pressures around her. That belief was nearly sacred. But the archivist slid a second envelope across the table to Charles, its weight crushing what little calm remained. This seal bore no royal crest, only her delicate handwriting, "To the one who knows." Charles hesitated before opening it with shaking hands. Inside was a name that struck like a thunderclap. Not Catherine Middleton, who wouldn't enter William's life for years, but someone entirely unexpected. The atmosphere grew heavy with confusion and disbelief as Diana's instructions came to light. She had entrusted her most treasured personal items, her private journals, a locket she never parted with, and letters she never sent, to this mysterious Catherine. William and Harry exchanged puzzled glances, both subtly shaking their heads, silently denying any idea who this woman could be. Even composed William appeared shaken, his eyes narrowing as he whispered the name under his breath as if saying it aloud might bring understanding. But no answers came. Charles demanded an explanation, his voice trembling as he pressed for who Catherine was, what her relationship had been, and why Diana would bypass her own sons to leave her most intimate belongings to a stranger. The archivist remained stone-faced, lips pressed tight, as if centuries of royal silence forbade him from speaking. Then came Diana's most unsettling declaration: that Catherine was the only one I trust to protect the boys when I am gone. The words pierced the room like a blade, lingering long after Charles had read them aloud. In her darkest hours, Diana had doubted even the royal family's ability to keep her sons safe. She saw shadows where others saw duty, reaching beyond the palace walls for protection. The note's final chilling line was hastily added at the bottom: "If you deny her what is hers, the crown itself will turn against you." Yet the most frightening revelation wasn't about whom Diana trusted, but the warnings she left behind if her wishes were ignored. Charles's face paled as he read on. Diana hadn't just left instructions, she predicted what would come after her death. The next pages offered no warmth, only a grim prophecy. She spoke of a shadow campaign, a deliberate effort to erase her memory from the public's heart and rewrite the monarchy's story without her. They would paint her not as a victim, but as a disruptive force to their order. Her words hinted she'd already witnessed this in the months before her death. She feared her sons would be consumed by it too. This time, she listed names not as enemies, but as hidden allies, trusted figures who would rise to defend her legacy if the palace tried to silence it. She claimed these allies held proof, tapes, letters, photographs, and that they were watching even now. Each name hung in the air like a warning, daring anyone to challenge her memory. At the bottom, scrawled almost carelessly but with clear menace, was one final phrase: "The crown will crack from within." No explanation followed, but its stark placement left no doubt. Diana believed the monarchy itself would crumble if her warnings were ignored. William's calm finally broke as he read her next words written directly to him. She warned he would face trials beyond endurance, forces bent on breaking him and tearing him from everything he believed in. He swallowed hard, the tremor in his hands betraying his calm. Then came the passage about Harry. Diana wrote with deep sorrow, believing her youngest son had already been marked as the spare pawn, meant to be moved aside and sacrificed when convenient, never free to forge his own path. Harry visibly flinched, his jaw tightening as if holding back words he wasn't ready to voice. Finally, Charles reached the last line of that section, his voice breaking as he read it aloud. It was brief, harsh, and unforgiving. "You already know what you've done." His hands dropped, the page slipping from his fingers, eyes glistening with guilt more than grief. Just when it seemed the revelations had ended, the archivist unlocked one last drawer, revealing a sealed wooden box no one dared touch. Inside lay tangible proof, secrets the royal family had fought to keep hidden. The archivist's hand lingered over the lid, his gaze warning, as if he understood the weight of what was inside. When the box was opened, silence fell. Inside were neatly organized photographs, letters, and tapes, each labeled in Diana's handwriting, some marked with chilling notes like, "For the people and not to be burned." These were no mere keepsakes, but evidence, ammunition in a silent war. She had prepared for this moment. On top were brittle, yellowed audio tapes. William picked one up and placed it in the recorder. Diana's voice filled the room, calm, deliberate, and quietly furious. She spoke openly about her darkest fears, confessing how trapped she felt in a palace of whispers, where every word and move was recorded and twisted. She named those she believed conspired to isolate her, who turned her children into pawns, who, as she put it, made me a ghost before they buried me. Beneath the tapes were photographs of dozens of these figures, snapshots of secret meetings between courtiers and media, smiles too polished, handshakes too calculated. The accompanying notes claimed this was proof of a carefully staged humiliation campaign, designed to systematically destroy her image for public consumption. There was also a letter addressed to the press but never sent, accusing specific individuals of orchestrating her downfall. She insisted every scandal was no accident, but manufactured to strip her dignity until she vanished. But what shocked them most was what Charles found at the bottom of the box, a small velvet pouch holding a locket. Inside was a photo so damning it froze him in place. His knuckles whitened as he stared at the image. When William asked what he'd found, Charles said nothing, his face pale as death. Then the archivist spoke, quietly but firmly. "Once opened, there is no going back." His words carried a weight none dared deny. Everyone knew what had started in that room could never be undone. Then came the final envelope, heavier, thicker, marked boldly in red ink. "My last word." Diana's ultimate message wasn't just for her family, it was for the world, and it carried a demand no one in the room felt they could meet. The weight of her entire life seemed to press down within that envelope. When Charles broke the seal and unfolded the thick parchment, his hands shook so violently that William reached out instinctively, though even he hesitated to touch it. The words at the top hit them all immediately. "To my people." This time there was no privacy, no coded hints or veiled accusations, just a raw, honest message to the millions who had loved her. Despite the palace's efforts to erase her, she began by thanking the public, not for loyalty to the crown, but for the love they showed her when she felt utterly alone. She wrote about how the warmth from strangers kept her going longer than she ever thought possible. She confessed she knew she wouldn't live to see her sons become the men they were meant to be. But her greatest hope was that her boys would grow into men the people could believe in, even if the monarchy could not. Then her tone darkened. She revealed that she once planned to escape, meticulously mapping out a quiet life where no one could find her. But her words hinted at forces beyond her control. She believed she had been pulled back before she could break free, trapped in a gilded cage until the very end. Then came her demand, sharp and unyielding. The monarchy must reform itself or face what she called irreparable collapse. Her message was clear. Change or perish. Ignoring the cracks she felt would be their downfall, and eventually, those fractures would tear the crown apart. Her final plea was for her sons. In a heartfelt appeal, she begged William and Harry to remain united brothers, no matter how hard the palace tried to drive them apart. She warned that bitterness or ambition could destroy their bond, and without each other, they would be lost. As Charles reached the letter's end, his strength seemed to leave him completely. The paper slipped from Charles's fingers as he sank into his chair, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths, his face pale and streaked with tears. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with grief, guilt, and unspoken truths no one dared voice. But the stillness didn't last long. William rose, clutching the documents tightly, and declared that the truth could no longer be buried. The room erupted into chaos. The princes were divided, and Charles was inconsolable. Outside the palace walls, the press already sensed something earth-shattering had occurred. The weight of Diana's revelations hung thick in the air, shattering the fragile calm that followed her final words. William stood rigid, knuckles white as he gripped the papers, his voice rising with anger and determination. He insisted the truth must come out, that Diana's voice had been silenced long enough, and the world deserved to know what she endured and what she left behind. His words echoed through the vaulted room, startling even Harry. But Harry hesitated. His face revealed a battle of conflicting emotions, torn between loyalty to the institution that raised him and the memory of a mother destroyed by it. He glanced between William and Charles, wrestling with the impossible choice of where to stand in history. His silence spoke volumes, though it was clear his heart leaned toward William. Charles, meanwhile, was desperate. Tears still stained his cheeks as he pleaded with his sons not to destroy the monarchy. His voice cracked under the strain, his hands trembling as he tried to reason with them, warning that these revelations couldn't be undone, that once Diana's accusations went public, they wouldn't just tarnish the crown, they could break it. His desperation was almost pitiful, his authority slipping with every moment. The archivist, who had been silent throughout, moved toward the vault and began locking it once again. As the heavy door sealed, he turned to the family with a grim expression, offering no comfort, only acknowledgement of what they'd unleashed. In a barely audible whisper, he spoke 6 words that chilled the room. "The crown will never be the same." William and Harry exchanged one last glance, not of unity, but of resolve. Even in disagreement, they both understood Diana's truth could no longer stay hidden. Then came the sound of hurried footsteps outside, urgent and insistent. Just beyond the door, the faint murmur of cameras being readied. The palace walls suddenly felt thinner, the whispers outside growing louder by the second. Within hours, the first leaks hit the press. Headlines screamed that Diana's secret will had been uncovered. The word betrayal splashed across newspapers in bold letters. Thus began the firestorm Diana had warned of, a reckoning burning through the House of Windsor. In the days that followed, Britain watched in stunned silence as the monarchy buckled under the weight of her final truths. What started as whispers quickly grew into a roar no one could contain. Excerpts from Diana's secret will dominated front pages, her words printed alongside photos of her radiant smile and haunting accusations. "The crown will crack from within," one headline blared, less a warning, more a prophecy unfolding before their eyes. Public outrage ignited like dry tinder. People who once cheered royal processions now gathered outside Buckingham Palace, shouting, weeping, demanding answers. The gates became walls of flowers and fury. Candles flickered day and night, the air thick with calls for justice and truth. Each day brought more damning revelations from the vault, and with them, crowds only grew louder and bolder. Charles, overwhelmed by fury and grief, vanished from public view. For days, he was nowhere to be seen, palace insiders quietly admitting he'd become unreachable, locked away, consumed by guilt no title could shield him from. Those who glimpsed him said he looked hollow, defeated, a man crushed beneath the weight of his crown. In his absence, William stepped forward. For the first time, the public saw him as a future king. Outside the palace gates, he faced the cameras with quiet defiance, clutching his mother's words. His voice cut through the noise like a blade. "My mother's voice will not be silenced. Not now. Not ever." The crowd erupted, grief and pride swelling together. Beside him, Harry finally spoke, his words fragile but powerful. He acknowledged the family's fractures, the bitterness and pain that had long divided them. But he reminded everyone that beneath the pomp and ceremony, they were simply sons who had lost their mother too soon. "We loved her," he said simply. And in that moment, the world felt it. The monarchy stood fractured, its image forever changed. Some clung to it, insisting it would endure as always. But even they saw it bore scars it could never hide. Diana's truth had pierced the facade, forcing the House of Windsor to confront ghosts long buried. As the dust settled, one thing was clear. Diana's true will had finally been heard, and it would echo through the halls of power forever. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and